2. The death penalty. A man will act on his faith, and, if his faith be humanistic, inevitably his basic standard will be man, not God's law. He will view the world not as God's handiwork, but as his own. A theologian of the Death of God school, William Hamilton, has called attention to the fact that man now rarely looks at the starry sky with a sense of reverence for God. Instead, he cites his experience with his son as illustrative of a new attitude. Quote, "The other night I was out in the backyard with one of my children, who had to identify some constellations for his science homework. My son is a full citizen of the modern world, and said to me, after he had located the required constellations, 'Which are the ones we put up there, Dad?' He had become a technological man, and this means something religiously." End quote. The boy's reaction was clearly logical. If the God of Scripture does not exist, then man is his own God, and the world's Lord and Maker. Moreover, if man is his own God, then man and man's life are the highest value. The greatest sin then becomes the taking of life. Accordingly, Arthur Miller, the dramatist, declares that, quote, "Life is God's most precious gift. No principle, however glorious, may justify the taking of it." End quote. It follows from such a faith that the worst kind of sin is capital punishment, the deliberate taking of life by the state. This was precisely the point made by an editorial in the New York Herald Tribune, May 3, 1960, a barbarous form of punishment, protesting the execution of Carol Chessman. Quote, "Chessman succeeded in making himself a worldwide symbol of the fight against the death penalty. He may or may not have been guilty 12 years ago of robbery and sexual assault, called kidnapping by a strange quirk of California law. The courts found him guilty. To the end, he maintained his innocence, and the germ of doubt thus left will continue to cloud the case. But certainly the man killed yesterday by the sovereign state of California was not the same man whom that state's courts originally sentenced. California sentenced a young thug. It killed a man who had learned the law, and probably citizenship, the hard way. The law should inculcate respect for life by itself respecting the sanctity of life. The state should not, as California did yesterday, put itself in the position of the errant father telling his wayward son, 'Do as I say, not as I do.' Death is final. It leaves no room for second thoughts, or for correction of the errors that are a mathematical certainty in a system of justice based on fallible human judgment. And the quintessential premeditation which judicial killing represents makes it more coldly vicious than a crime of passion. The very concept of a death chamber is antithetical to the ideals of Western civilization." End quote. In terms of such a faith, the most vicious people of all are those who favor the death penalty. By their offense against man, they commit the unpardonable sin for humanism. In order to give man the preeminence, the humanist logically must destroy any concept of justice as a real and objective standard. Man must be above law, and therefore above justice. Justice is therefore reduced to rationalization and organized hatred. Thus, a University of Leicester sociologist has written of justice, quote, "But could all this instead perhaps be some kind of historical confidence trick? It has already been suggested that our idea of justice may be a rationalization of what is at bottom punitive behavior. This would not be to argue that the idea of justice is a fake, but rather that instead of taking it at face value, we might try to understand what needs it is intended to satisfy. It may appear then as a kind of collective psychological defense. As proof of the validity of our ideals, we are often inclined to refer to the sense of conviction that we and other people possess about them. Most of us certainly have strong convictions about the rightness of the ideal of justice. But all that a sense of conviction does is to prove its appropriateness for us, that in the present state of our emotional economy, such a belief has for us a very special and much needed part to play. But justice seen in this light is not merely the solvent of unrest within us. It is a positive outlet through which these tensions can be discharged in, as it seems to us, a constructive fashion. Through the idea of justice, the bad things within us are transformed into something new and worthwhile. All this, so long as we do not look too closely at the outcome. For to stand the famous phrase upon its head and thus perhaps give it more validity, justice may more often, quote, manifestly appear to be done, end quote, than to be done in fact, end quote. Justice William O. Douglas has pointed out the obvious fact that law once had a divine sanction and rested on, quote-unquote, God's will. Now, however, the sovereignty of God has been replaced by, quote, the sovereignty of the individual, end quote. In terms of this, for Douglas, the civil liberties struggle is of necessity hostile to the old order. Indeed, quote, law and order is the guiding star of the totalitarians, not of free men, end quote. For Douglas, quote, revolution is therefore basic in the rights of man, end quote. And naturally so, since man is above the law, and submission to the law is tyranny. In a quote-unquote decent society, there is respect for and effort to preserve, quote, the sovereignty and honor, as well as the dignity of each and every individual, end quote. In the anarchistic world of Douglas, what law can bind man who is above the law? And what state can survive if free men are those who are hostile to law and order? Clearly, a religious war is in process between humanism and Christianity, and in that war, church, state, and school are almost wholly on the side of humanism as against Christianity. But history has never been determined by majorities, but rather always and only by God. The struggle is between God's absolute justice and his law order, and man's lawless self-assertion and autonomy. God's law order requires the death penalty for capital offenses against that realm. Man's law claims to value life too highly to take it, but humanistic societies do exact death for those whom they deem to be their enemies. The death penalty appears at the onset of God's covenant with Noah. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast I will require it, and at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's beast will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he him. Genesis 9, 5-6. Not only every murderer, but every animal which kills a man must pay with its life. God requires this of a country, and brings judgment finally for non-compliance. As Rand noted, quote, contrary to popular belief, the Bible does not hold life cheaply. It is a serious thing to take life, and for the taking of life, the murderer forfeits his life, end quote. For this reason, there can be no ransoming or pardoning of murder, as distinguished from accidental killing, nor a ransom taken, for to do so is to defile the land where God dwells in the midst of his people. Numbers 35, 29-34. In terms of biblical law, the required modes of punishment as summarized by Rand were as follows. Quote, 1. The death penalty for capital offenses. 2. Whipping from 1 to 40 stripes for minor offenses. 3. In cases of stealing and destruction of another man's property, restitution, to which must be added from 100 to 400% as punishment. 4. Those who were financially unable to make restitution or pay the fine were compelled to contribute their work and labor until the debt had been fully paid. And 5. Confinement in a city of refuge for accidental killing, end quote. The replacement of this system by imprisonment is relatively recent. Quote, as late as 1771, a French criminologist wrote that imprisonment was permissible only in the case of people awaiting trial, end quote. But, quote, today, prison is all there is. The death penalty is out of fashion. Only one man was executed for crime in the United States after legal process in 1966, end quote. The prison system, a humanistic device, is now under attack by the humanists, who want to replace it with the mental institution and psychiatric retraining. However, since their theory holds that it is a sick society, which breeds sick men or criminals, the major attempt is to have psychological reconditioning or brainwashing of all people by means of the schools, pulpit, press, and television. Humanistic environmentalism requires such an approach. Marxism, as a more rigorous form of environmentalism, is dedicated to a total remaking of the social environment. This humanistic environmentalism is a form of the same basic evolutionary faith which was formulated by Lamarck. Man can be and is determined by his environment and by acquired characteristics rather than by his own inner being. Not man's sin, but the world around him determines man's will. Thus, the Marxist Lincoln Steffens, in referring to man's fall, blamed not Adam nor Eve, nor the serpent. Quote, "It was, it is, the apple." End quote. That is, the environment, the world man lives in. From such a perspective, it is wrong to blame man. It is the world which must be remade by man to be fit for man. To punish man is thus seen as evil. It is God who made the world, and the men who under God established God's law order who must be punished. Thus, between biblical law and humanistic law, there is an unbridgeable gap and an unceasing warfare. The principle involved in the biblical law of punishment is stated in Exodus 21:23-25. "Thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." Some choose to interpret this literally, but the very context, Exodus 21:1-36, a delineation of offenses and penalties, makes it clear that it means that the punishment must fit the crime. It must be proportionate to the offense, neither lesser nor greater. This principle is restated in Leviticus 24:17-21 and Deuteronomy 19:21. The comment of Oler is of interest. Quote, "The Mosaic principle of punishment is the jus talionis, as it is repeatedly expressed in the sentence, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. Exodus 21:23-25, Leviticus 24:18 and following, Deuteronomy 19:21, "It shall be done to him who has offended as he has done." In other words, the punishment is a retribution corresponding in quantity and quality to the wicked deed. But that the talio is not meant to be understood in a merely external sense is not only shown by various provisions of punishment, but by the fact that not simply the deed itself, but the guilt lying at the root of the deed is often taken into account in determining the punishment. The punishment of death is attached apparently to a large number of crimes. It is prescribed not only for the crime of murder, maltreatment of parents, man-stealing, Exodus 21:12 and following, adultery, incest, and other unnatural crimes, idolatry, and the practice of heathen divination and witchcraft, Leviticus 20, Deuteronomy 13:6 and following, but for overstepping certain fundamental ordinances of the theocracy, the law of circumcision, Genesis 17:14, the law of the Passover, Exodus 12:15 and 19, the Sabbath law, 31:14 and following, the pollution of sacrifices, Leviticus 7:20 and following, sacrificing at other places than the sanctuary, 17:8 and following, certain laws of purification, 22:2, Numbers 19:13 and 20. Yet the peculiar expression "to be cut off from the people" is chosen for the punishment of transgressions of the latter class in distinction from the former, an expression which indeed cannot refer to simple banishment, as some have interpreted it, but still in some cases seems to point to a punishment to be executed not by human judgment, but by the divine power, what is said in Leviticus 17:10 with reference to the person who eats blood. "I will blot out that person." When the punishment was really to be executed by human judgment, the term "he shall be put to death" is used, as of the violation of the Sabbath law, Exodus 31:14, and in the passages of the former kind, Exodus 21:12 and following, Leviticus 20, etc. In general, in all cases where the people did not execute judgment on the transgressor, Jehovah himself reserves the exercise of justice to himself. See as main passage Leviticus 20, verses 4-6. End quote. There are thus two kinds of capital punishment. First, God directly executes judgment and death upon men and nations for certain offenses. This he does at his time and will, and none can say him nay. Second, God delegates to man the duty of inflicting death for certain offenses, and that without undue delay and without hesitation. In examining the obligation of man to inflict the death penalty, we see first that normally no ransom or fine could be paid for murder to release the guilty, as Numbers 35:31 declared, "Moreover, ye shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer, which is guilty of death, but he shall be surely put to death." The one exception to this is in cases where an ox with a record of goring kills a man. The owner then shall be put to death, unless there be laid on him a sum of money. Then he shall give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. Exodus 21:29-30. In such cases, because the ox is the primary murderer, there is a possibility of escape for the owner. Second, as appears in the case of the goring ox, biblical law holds animals as well as men liable for murder charges. This clearly appears in Genesis 9:5 as well as in the law. If a man owns an animal, and the animal kills a man, the animal dies. The owner is not guilty if the animal has no previous record of unprovoked violence. Exodus 21:28. But if the animal had a record of violence in the past, then the owner is liable for murder charges and capital punishment. For a free man, ransom was possible. With slaves, the ransom is specified by law, 30 shekels of silver, to prevent undue ransom being required for a slave as the alternative to death. Exodus 21:29-32. An offense by an ox against another man's ox is also guilty before the law and liable. If the criminal animal had no previous record, then it must be sold, and the proceeds divided between the two owners. And the killed ox is also sold and the proceeds divided. But if the criminal ox had a record of misconduct, then it is sold and the proceeds given entirely to the owner of the dead ox, who retains possession of the proceeds of the dead ox. Exodus 21:35-36. This principle of animal liability and the liability of their owners is still a part of our law. If the executed ox was killed by stoning, its flesh could not be eaten, having not been bled. Exodus 21:28. A strange modern application or misapplication of this law appears in a modernist commentary. Quote, "The animals that kill men today are not oxen but tiny organisms, germs of disease. If the possessors of these are careless in spreading them around, they too should be put to death or charged a very high ransom." End quote. Third, we have seen that the principle is life for life, that is, a punishment proportionate to the crime. This crime has no reference to the criminal or his mentality, but only to the nature of the act. If death is the penalty for animals on the principle of life for life, then this is certainly true for men. Thus, on this principle, biblical law has no plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Neither is there any privileged status before the law for a minor. Murder requires the death penalty whether the offender is an animal, an quote-unquote insane man, a child, or a feeble-minded person. The modern plea of not guilty by reason of insanity arose in 1843 in the trial of Daniel Macnaghten for the murder of Edward Drummond, secretary to Sir Robert Peel. As a result of Macnaghten's trial, the Macnaghten rules were developed. It was A, presumed that every man is sane until the contrary is proved, but B, a man who was insane or laboring under a defect of reason while committing the act, so that he did not realize the nature of the act or its wrongness, was not guilty by reason of insanity. Macnaghten was committed to an asylum instead of being executed. The Macnaghten rules led to the decision in 1954 by David D. Bazelon of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia that no one could be held, quote, criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease or mental defect, end quote. This was the Durham case, the trial of Monty Durham, a housebreaker and check passer who had been in and out of jails and mental hospitals for 7 of his 24 years. Such pleas as the Macnaghten and Durham rules permit the courts to set aside the life-for-life principle, the principle of justice and justice itself, in favor of a humanistic concern for the life of the criminal. Supposedly, prisons are quote-unquote punitive and heartless as compared to mental treatment. But as Mayer has noted, quote, the most cursory look at our institutions reveals that some prisons in Wisconsin, in California, and in the federal system are in fact much less punitive than the ordinary state mental hospital, and a man is not likely to be much better off in the job market later if his record shows a civil commitment to an institution for the criminally insane rather than a conviction for a crime." End quote. The prison system is a humanistic device, an ostensibly more humane way of treatment than the older biblical law required. Now the mental health approach is supposedly even more humane, when in actuality, as Solomon long ago noted, that here as elsewhere, the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Proverbs 12:10. But we are told by psychiatrists like Menninger that society can be made healthy only by replacing, quote, "the punitive attitude with a therapeutic attitude," end quote. To demand punishment of criminals is to reveal our own mental sickness. He speaks of it, in fact, as the quote-unquote crime of punishment, so that in his eyes the good people of society are all criminals when they demand punishment. Menninger holds that the crime of society against the criminal is greater than that of the criminal against society. Quote, "I suspect that all the crimes committed by all the jailed criminals do not equal in total social damage that of the crimes committed against them." End quote. Of the criminal, Menninger says, quote, "We need criminals to identify ourselves with, to envy secretly, and to punish stoutly. They do for us the forbidden, illegal things we wish to do, and like scapegoats of old, they bear the burdens of our displaced guilt and punishment, the quote-unquote iniquities of us all." End quote. As a humanist, Menninger regards man's life as the greatest good, and any injury to life as the greatest evil. Quote, "The great sin by which we are all tempted is the wish to hurt others, and this sin must be avoided if we are to live and let live." End quote. Similar opinions are to be found in the legal profession and, in fact, dominate it. This was apparent in the 1968 Convention of the American Bar Association, ABA. The kind of thinking which appealed to many was definitely to the left and was all humanistic. Thus, quote, "A Negro lawyer, William Coleman of Philadelphia, argued that society should be prepared to sanction a certain amount of unrest and inconvenience as the price of progress. He contended that persons engaged in civil disobedience should be paid for their trouble in fighting unjust laws. When a cause is worthy, agreed Lewis H. Pollock, Dean of Yale Law School, prosecutors should refuse to press charges against persons engaged in civil disobedience. He did not set forth specific guidelines for determining whether a cause is worthy." End quote. Of course, rioters were already being extensively subsidized in their civil disobedience and rioting, as numerous studies and reports have demonstrated, federal grants being generously given. There was a dissenting voice at the ABA convention, a guest, Lord Justice Widgery of the Court of Appeals in England. Quote, "After listening to conferences on crime and civil disorder for 5 days, the British jurist said it had, quote, struck me very forcibly that I have heard not one word of commendation or criticism of the police, the shock troops in the fight against crime." End quote. "How do lawyers and judges expect to keep the peace," he said, quote, "unless they have an efficient police force?" End quote. The Lord Justice also questioned the dictum expressed moments earlier by Attorney General Clark that, quote, "poverty is the mother of crime," end quote. Lord Justice Widgery dryly advised his audience not to, quote, "attach too much importance to this theory. Anyone who thinks relief of poverty will bring a decrease in crime is in for some kind of disappointment," he said. The greatest part of England's slums, he said, were razed by World War II bombing, so poor housing is no excuse for crime. And Britain has had, quote, "very great success with its Robin Hood fiscal policy of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and you would think there would be a drop in the crime figures. But nothing like this has happened. There's been an increase in every department," end quote, among the poor, the middle class, and the well-to-do. Crime and civil disorder continue to increase, he suggests, because societies throughout the Western world have, quote-unquote, "lost discipline, acceptance by its members of a code of discipline," end quote. In 1968, the Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, quoting the Fabian socialist George Bernard Shaw, that, quote, "Murder and capital punishment are not opposites that cancel one another, but similars that breed their kind," end quote, urged Congress to abolish capital punishment for federal crimes. According to Clark's testimony before a Senate subcommittee, quote, "In the midst of anxiety and fear, complexity and doubt, perhaps our greatest need is reverence for life, mere life, our lives, the lives of others, all life. A humane and generous concern for every individual, for his safety, his health, and his fulfillment will do more to soothe the savage heart than the fear of state-inflicted death, which chiefly serves to remind us how close we remain to the jungle," end quote. The courts today, moving in terms of humanistic law, are already hostile to law and order. As Gardner has pointed out, quote, "The rights of the individual are being protected, provided the individual has committed a crime," end quote. The concern for the criminal has reached the point where prison chaplains in Germany have formed a labor union for convicts, and West Germany has given the union a charter. To return to the insanity plea, some cities already have a separate psychiatric court, as witness Los Angeles, to which many cases are referred. Quote, "The court handles all cases involving mental illnesses, including court commitments of persons to mental hospitals, civil and criminal narcotics cases, and determinations for the municipal courts on questions of criminal insanity," end quote. The move to abolish the death penalty substitutes quote-unquote medicine for morals, and it denies, quote, "the legal doctrine of individual responsibility," end quote, one of the fundamentals of godly law. The door to pagan savagery is opened by this psychiatric approach. Instead of individual responsibility, guilt, and punishment, group responsibility, guilt, and punishment is stressed. The society at large and the family get the blame, not the criminal. The time is drawing closer when it will be dangerous to be innocent of crime, because innocence will constitute the greatest guilt. This is already the belief of the civil rights revolutionists. Already, the defense in one court case indicates the direction of the law. A convicted rapist who entered a belated plea of innocent by reason of insanity has been defended in court on two grounds. A, he has an abnormal chromosome makeup, and B, he felt rejected by women. In fact, Menninger has declared, quote, "The unconscious fear of women goads some men with a compulsive urge to conquer, humiliate, hurt, or render powerless some available sample of womanhood," end quote. The rapist is not guilty. His fears and perhaps his chromosomes also drive him to rape. Menninger has made clear his belief in the guilt of the innocent. The criminal is not responsible. He is quote-unquote driven by society to crime. Thus, as a Mrs. John Connolly of St. Paul, Minnesota, said of Sirhan Bishara Sirhan when his trial for the murder of Senator Robert F. Kennedy began, quote, "I think this poor fellow Sirhan is a very sad creature. It's hard to imagine anyone who would be driven to something like this," end quote. If Sirhan and other criminals are quote-unquote driven men, then someone did the driving and is therefore guilty. And if the criminal is predetermined to crime by his environment, the humanists, by asserting this, have substituted determinism by the environment for predestination by God. Fourth, the death penalty is required by Scripture for a number of offenses. These are for 1. Murder, but not for accidental killings, Exodus 21:12-14. 2. Striking or cursing a parent, Exodus 21:15, Leviticus 20:9, Proverbs 20:20, Matthew 15:4, Mark 7:10. It should be noted that Christ condemned the scribes and Pharisees for setting aside this law. 3. Kidnapping, Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7. 4. Adultery, Leviticus 20:10-21, to be discussed later. 5. Incest, Leviticus 20:11-12 and 14. 6. Bestiality, Exodus 22:19, Leviticus 20:15-16. 7. Sodomy or homosexuality, Leviticus 20:13. 8. Unchastity, Deuteronomy 22:20-21, to be discussed later. 9. Rape of a betrothed virgin, Deuteronomy 22:23-27. 10. Witchcraft, Exodus 22:18. 11. Offering human sacrifice, Leviticus 20:2. 12. Incorrigible delinquency or habitual criminality. Deuteronomy 21, 18-21. 13. Blasphemy. Leviticus 24, 11-14, 16, and 23, already discussed earlier. 14. Sabbath desecration. Exodus 35:2, Numbers 15, 32-36, already discussed earlier, now superseded. 15. Propagation of false doctrines. Deuteronomy 13, 1-10, also discussed earlier. 16. Sacrificing to false gods. Exodus 22:20. 17. Refusing to abide by the court decision and thus denying the law. Deuteronomy 17, 8-13. 18. Failing to restore the pledge or bailment. Ezekiel 18, 12-13, because such an act destroyed the possibility of community trust and association. The methods of capital punishment were by burning, Leviticus 20, 14, and 21, 9, stoning, Leviticus 20, verse 2 and 27, 24, verse 14, Deuteronomy 21, 21, hanging, Deuteronomy 21, 22-23, Joshua 8, 29, and the sword, Exodus 32, 27-28. The use of the sword was in an exceptional circumstance, and the basic requirement in every case was the death penalty itself rather than the form of the penalty. Moreover, as Carey has pointed out, quote, capital punishment was never to be inflicted on the testimony of less than 2 witnesses, Numbers 35:30, Deuteronomy 17:6, and 19:15. In specified instances, capital punishment was to be executed by the witnesses themselves, as in Deuteronomy 13, 6-10, and 17, verse 7. In some instances, execution was by the congregation, Numbers 15, 32-36, Deuteronomy 13, 6-10, or by nearest of kin, the avenger of blood, Deuteronomy 19, 11-12, end quote. To the humanistic mind, these penalties seem severe and unnecessary. In actuality, the penalties, together with the biblical faith which motivated them, worked to reduce crime. Thus, when New England passed laws requiring the death penalty for incorrigible delinquents and for children who struck their parents, no executions were necessary. The law kept children in line. Some laws secure their desired effect without any necessity for prosecution. Thus, to cite one instance from the 1920s as described by Llewellyn, quote, the books of the New York Public Library persisted in disappearing. This was a field peculiarly of juvenile delinquency. The opportunity was open to all, but the rewards of theft so petty as to make juveniles the likely prospects. A statute was passed making exhibition for sale of a book bearing a library stamp an offense. The library officials saw to it that every second-hand book dealer in the city received notice of this statute. Promptly, the thefts decreased almost into nothingness. The market had become unprofitable. There has never been a prosecution under the law. There is no need. End quote. This is not always the case, for when the religious and moral character of a people disintegrate, the lawbreakers begin to outnumber the police and the law keepers. Biblical law eliminates the incorrigible and habitual criminals. Biblical faith gives to the people a godly character and a law-abiding disposition. The breakdown of humanistic law orders is due to the radical criminal disposition of its lawless peoples. In spite of all the extensive pity for criminals, the fact remains that 80% of all accused persons plead guilty. Some of the remaining 20% are guilty, but the complaining party has dropped the charges. Mayer notes of these that many are, quote, like our young man whose girl decided she wanted him even though he had beaten her to a pulp, end quote. To speed up the legal logjam, many guilty parties are allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge to avoid delay and expense. Other studies show of every 100 picked up by the police, as against those formally accused, 50 are convicted on a guilty plea, 5 are convicted after trial, 30 are released without charges being brought, 13 are released, quote, by administrative process after arraignment but before trial, end quote, and 2 are acquitted after trial. Thus, while in any fallible human system mistakes are made, they are obviously not very common. Justice has rough edges, but there is no alternative to justice. Moreover, as Mayer noted of New York's criminal courts, lawyers never wear hats, quote, because if you put a hat down anywhere in a criminal court building, somebody steals it, end quote. Moreover, quote, criminal practice is the one branch of the law where lawyers collect their fee in advance, end quote. The reason, of course, is the radical dishonesty of their clients. But more important is the situation with respect to juveniles. Quote, according to the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, 48% of all arrests for serious offenses in 1964 were arrests of children under the age of 18, and 43.3% of all those formerly charged with serious crimes by the police were referred to the juvenile court for disposition. The peak comes at age 15. Generally speaking, incidentally, the larger the city, the smaller the proportion of those under 18 in the total number of arrests. It has been estimated that 1/9 of the nation's children, 1/6 of the boys, make some contact with the juvenile court, usually for a quite minor offense, between the ages of 10 and 17. End quote. The figures after 1964 grew markedly worse. Too many of the children not involved in the juvenile courts are also schooled in lawlessness by humanistic education and religion. The result is the policeman's impossible task. Quote, in Berkeley on a Saturday night, there may be 2,000 pot parties going on. Can you have an informer or a policeman at each one? End quote. The law breaks down when the faith behind the law is gone. The hostility to the death penalty is humanism's hostility to God's law. But God's government prevails, and his alternatives are clear-cut. Either men and nations obey his laws, or God invokes the death penalty against them. We have cited above the high ratio of guilt in all indicted persons. This does not mean that innocent men are not sometimes condemned. The Dudley Boyle case appears to have been such a case. Dudley Boyle, a mining engineer and a high-spirited young man, was arrested during the Depression for robbing the Bank of Sparks. He was defended by McCarran, later U.S. Senator for Nevada, who was convinced of Boyle's innocence. The trial revealed amazing irregularities, as McCarran's daughter summarizes some of its aspects. Quote, one of the most unique devices used by the prosecution was that the state called to the witness stand the one man who could prove Dudley Boyle's alibi, that he had left Reno early on the morning of the robbery and journeyed by automobile to Goldfield. Summerfield elicited the man's name and address and then dismissed him from the stand. Thereafter, McCarran, continually overruled by Judge George Bartlett, was unable to cross-examine the man or elicit from him the confirmation of Boyle's alibi. This would be unbelievable if it were mere news reporting. The transcript is available. Even on appeal, Judge Edward A. Ducker, who had succeeded McCarran on the Supreme Court, handed down a terribly facile decision against Boyle, who had been sentenced from 5 to 20 years in the state prison. He was released after 6 years and subsequently committed suicide. When he had been working for parole, Boyle had written to McCarran, "You know and I know that I am innocent." This was unfortunately in the depth of the Depression when everyone was desperately distracted. There was much to suggest that when the owner of the Bank of Sparks desired a conviction, it could be obtained. End quote. This is not an isolated case, but it is not the common case. The fact is still true that virtually all indicted men are guilty, and they, in most cases, plead guilty. To avoid enforcing the law or to break down the law because of such cases of injustice is to compound the injustice. The enforcement of civil and criminal law is in the hands of sinful and fallible men. It cannot be made infallible. To improve the quality of law enforcement and to bring about greater obedience, it is necessary that we have more godly men. There is no answer, but only further decay in any weakening of the law. To use cases of injustice to destroy the law is itself a very great and deadly act of injustice.